had a breaker.
There.
Then they moved, they built a house and moved out.
Okay.
Next week he was getting the
Well,
phone.
all of
Amanda.
half was,
I said, wait, what did you say?
but ours was on, so that was.
You didn't go well. Yeah, our electricity is almost different.
Remember that?
Oh, yeah, you got rid
We
of
were
it.
paying
Very good.
10 cents a kilowatt. What's your?
Yay.
Same.
I don't know what choice
Well, I got on, I
No,
got
no,
on
it doesn't.
YouTube to make a comment, and Penny's was so good, I just left it there.
I didn't
Mom, what
even
was
see.
Your comment about
Aw.
your assignment.
Oh.
I didn't see it either. I was
She
looking
said
at
it all I
it.
was gonna say, so.
Well, you should have said it again, I would have felt better.
I didn't see it.
I didn't see it. No,
I said a great comment.
I saw pennies and I was like, well, I can't top that,
I
so,
didn't
I
see
mean.
That was everything I was thinking.
I didn't post mine. I brought mine.
Penny.
Penny, where is it?
I didn't realize you had so much wisdom in her.
Where did you post that? Cause I didn't see it.
Write in comments.
YouTube.
You
Under
sure
our chat.
did.
Yeah, on YouTube.
On you, oh, that's why I don't.
I'll read
don't
it.
get on.
You want me to read it?
Yes, please.
No, not.
Yes.
Are we live?
Yeah.
Yes, read
It's
it.
public.
No, read it.
It's already public.
Yes,
read
read it.
It's true.
Okay, David and Jonathan display a wonderful example of friendship. What a blessing to have a true Christian friend. They love, support, defend, inspire, encourage, and hold us spiritually accountable. Their godly advice, emotional support, loyalty, honesty, and reliability is priceless. Praying for one another and seeking God together makes life easier to navigate.
Beautiful.
Very good,
Very
Penny.
good.
Very good.
Perfect.
Yep.
Perfect.
We need to,
And I know that you put together something.
yeah, I've got a list, but I said it was too much and it's basically all of the
Well,
things that she
but
just
still
said.
you can share it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do. Beautiful. She said it all.
You have a list too? Did you do it?
Did I
Oh,
do it?
well.
What is my name?
I thought you pulled out your
The
paper
dog
and
ate it.
tried.
Hey.
No, but I did read Penny's, and one of the things that I loved about, because you can say all the same words, but I liked that she said reliability.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
that was
And
one that stuck out
accountability.
at me, and it made me think that maybe David, whenever things happen, maybe his first thought is, oh, you have that person, oh, I gotta tell Jonathan, or
Yes.
I gotta, I gotta call so-and-so, because you can count on them.
Mhm.
So I liked her word when I read it. That's
Yes.
as far as I
I've
got.
been blessed with good friends.
Good.
Mhm.
So
I wanna know what other thing you're good at.
everything.
I said, God bless you
Yeah.
because you're such a good
I'm
organizer.
organized,
And
and
you
I'm
said
a
that's one
fairly-
of two things. I'm going,
I'm a fairly decent mother.
oh,
And
okay.
wife. Can I be like?
I knew
Yes.
that. I knew what the other thing was.
I think you're
Mother.
an excellent mother
Thank you very
because you
Yes.
see the results.
Thank you very much. Well, I've only got one, and it makes it easy.
Yeah.
Not always.
Friendly, bubbly, and always
You're
smile.
good at everything.
Okay, come on.
Friends.
I've got great friends.
When did you go skiing?
All right, what did you get?
I didn't
What do
put
you have?
mine in the
Sorry.
context of Jonathan. I put it
Those are cool.
in the,
I didn't.
what I think of
They're on
a friend
Instagram.
that is godly is what I was saying. I said you both love God above all things. You both are honest, see past each other's flaws, able to point out flaws without malice, respect each other's privacy, love each other's friends and family, true concern for well-being, know each other well, pray for each other, see their beauty, defend their honor, that is loyalty, and give counsel with biblical reference.
That's a good one, Mary.
Very good.
Yep, very good. Those are all wonderful. I have quite a few of those as well on my list that I had last week. I think that I might add, because in the case of David and Jonathan, I think one thing that stood out to me was the fact that their friendship extended beyond Jonathan's life.
Mm.
So even beyond their own personal relationship, the friendship was still extended for the one that was living to the family of Jonathan. And I know they had a covenant together, but it was that important to both of them. And so David kept his word about it. I think that might have been the only one. No jealousy between true friends.
I added a
United
benefit for the benefit of a doubt, if
Okay,
you're talking and
Yeah.
and they don't quite get across what you thought it should be, you
Right.
just say, oh, well, she didn't mean it that way. Benefit of the doubt.
Yeah,
If
love.
you know the person.
Yeah, love
Yeah.
believes all things, doesn't
Right.
it? It hopes all.
I need
Tries
that a
to believe the
lot.
best.
Me
Because
too.
a lot of
Me
times
too.
what's up here doesn't
Yeah.
come out here.
Me too.
I know, it's
Yeah.
all jumbled up, that little
Yeah.
short space.
But a good friend knows that. They
Exactly,
know,
that's-
they know
yeah.
our
Yeah.
things, and they know.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's true.
I know, woo, she done that day.
Yep.
Make it
Go ahead and
work.
give you that so you can hand that out. Okay.
Connie's had to get on me a lot in the hearing. It's okay, I needed it.
Moving on, we are going to
I get,
That'll be good.
thank you.
move into David in the wilderness. So I've handed out a map that has many of the locations that we're going to read about today.
I love it.
This was the best map that I could find that had the least amount of writing on it. So the reason why I like it is so that I can write on it and put my own notes on it. But it's a little bit, as you can tell, it's a little bit skewed, but I couldn't help that. It's the way it was. But anyway, so this just focuses on Canaan here. As you can tell, there's Jerusalem there, there's Bethlehem, all of those places. No, Jerusalem, they don't even have it on here. Sorry. Bethlehem's on here. Oh, yeah, there it is.
Here it is. Jeebus.
Okay, Gibeah, of course, it says Gibeah of Saul. That was Saul's home town. That was where his kingdom centered. David's is going to eventually be in Jerusalem. Of course, we know David was born in Bethlehem, or at least that's where he was from. Right? Okay, so we are going to, we know, where we left off is David is officially on the run from Saul. With the help of his wife and with the help of his friend Jonathan, David first went to Samuel at Ramah. Ramah is at the very top of this page. That's where Samuel lived. He goes to Samuel at Ramah and is protected there in chapter 19. And there's a situation, Mary asked me about this last week, about the prophesying, all the prophesying that was going on in chapter 19. And I told her that we would get to that, except we're not going to do that today. We're going to get to that next week.
I'll write that down.
Because there's a lot of questions there, and but we'll touch on it next week. But after visiting Jonathan in chapter 20, this is where the arrows are shot and all that happened in chapter 20. We talked about that last week. In chapter 21, David runs to Nob, and so you can see that there just below, south of Ramah, above Jerusalem a little bit. Nob. So this is where we're going to pick up with David. It isn't very far from Ramah. But this is where we pick up with David in chapter 21, and we are going to track David chapter by chapter, location by location, as we move through here. So all of my notes are by chapter, but also by location. And we're going to highlight some things that happened at each location pretty much. And this is a lot of material because this is 6 chapters? We read through 25. That's how far we're going to go today. And there is so much more than I'm going to be able to present today. But maybe this will spark a little bit of deeper study if you wanted to do that. Okay, so beginning in chapter 21, David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Okay, Nob, a lot of things happen here. Nob apparently is where the tabernacle now is. This is where there's 85 priests here, we later learn. And so this is where the tabernacle in essence is. It used to be at Shiloh, but now it's moved here. And then eventually, once David reigns, it's going to be in Jerusalem. Okay, but for now it's in Nob with Ahimelech the priest. Perhaps he's the high priest there, not sure. But we do know that there are 85 other priests working there. Okay, What do I want to say about this? Okay, so Ahimelech, it says, is afraid when David came to him, and he said to him, "Why are you alone, and no one is with you?" This was unusual, out of character, for David to show up without an entourage, without his army. I mean, he was the commander of 1,000. I mean, you know, he was high up in Saul's army. And apparently he was alone, but I don't think he was totally alone, and this is why I say that, because he says, "I need bread for my men, me and my men." And then I don't know if you recall that Jesus in the New Testament references this occasion and acknowledges that David had men. So, we know he had some men. How many? I don't know. Not as many as Ahimelech would expect, I'm sure. He didn't have very many, but he had a few men. And so he asks the king for bread, and he asks the priest for bread, and the priest says what? Do you remember?
We only have consecrated bread.
Right.
Right.
And it's for people, the men who have not had relations.
Right. The bread is actually for the priests
Priests,
only,
yes,
really.
Right.
But the Ahimelech makes an exception here and says, okay, it's getting ready to change out. This bread was changed every week, and so there's 12 loaves. Exodus explains there's 6 in a row, and apparently there was 5 left that hadn't been eaten. And so they were getting ready to be changed out, and so Ahimelech says, well, I only have these 5, but he wants to make sure there's at least some purity going on, I guess, among David's men. And so David says, yeah, we've all been kept clean and pure from women and stuff like that. So he gives them this bread. Now, let's see here. Do y'all remember when Jesus references this occasion? Did anybody look into that or read into that? Okay, here's where it is. You ready? Matthew 12, verses 1 through 9. We'll go there in a minute. Mark 2, I don't know if anybody want to write this down. Mark 2, verses 23 through 28. And Luke 6, verses 1 through 5. Let's go to well, we can go to Matthew. We'll just go to Matthew. Because I know we have to speed through here. So Matthew 12. I know y'all know this occasion. The Pharisees came to Jesus and said, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And what were the disciples doing on the Sabbath?
Picking grain.
Heads of grain.
Plucking grain, that's verse 1. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And the Pharisees didn't like that. But Jesus brings to their mind this occasion that we were studying in 1 Samuel 21. He says in verse 3, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? So he brings to their attention their hero, David. They would never, ever, ever say that David did anything wrong there. But Jesus is equating the situations here. David didn't violate any kind of moral law, and neither did the disciples here. It's a matter of ceremony, right? But the point that Jesus makes here, in verse 7, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I desire mercy, compassion on a human at a human level more than I desire your ceremonial sacrifices. You see what trumps here? Yeah, and so it's the same situation here in Matthew 12 with Jesus' disciples as it is over here with David eating the showbread. He was hungry. The human element, the mercy that Ahimelech had on David and his men trumps the ceremonial laws of only the priests eating these loaves. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the main idea there. I don't know if we have to say anything more about that. Okay, well, let's hop on over back to where we were, 1 Samuel 21. Ahimelech not only gives David food, this bread, but he also gives him a sword. Whose sword was it?
The one he
Goliath.
Goliath had.
Goliath's sword, very good. He was happy to have that, I'm sure.
I don't know how he could carry it.
Yeah, it was probably pretty
Yeah.
heavy. Maybe wore it on his back.
Maybe.
But we also learn from, look at chapter 22 and verse 10. We may be wondering why did David go to Nob, to this priest? Well, I think verse 10 helps us a little bit. In chapter 22 and verse 10, it's recalling this, and it says here, and he inquired of the Lord for him, meaning that Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for David. So David probably went to Ahimelech so that Ahimelech could inquire of the Lord on what David now was supposed to do, because he's on the run alone, essentially, right? He's running for his life. So this helps us to know that he didn't just go there for food. He went there for direction from God, from the priest, right? And so the priest apparently inquired of the Lord for David and gave him provisions and then gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So that all happens here in the first half of chapter 21. There is a man here, an Edomite, who's introduced in chapter 21, verse 7. A certain man of the servant of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. Okay, we don't learn anything more about him in this chapter, but he comes into play in the next chapter. All right, so we'll talk about him in just a second. Okay, any questions about where David in Nob? Any comments? Okay, so then beginning in verse 10 of chapter 21, where does David go next? Yeah, right, which is kind of an unusual spot, you'd think, right? And it's kind of far. I have here, I think it's like 20 some miles. I have here on my paper 23. So from Nob to Gath, it's a pretty good distance, but it's Philistine territory, right? And perhaps he was thinking, well, Saul will never look there because Saul is afraid of the Philistines. So he was, I guess, David was taking a chance, maybe. And we know what happens here, right? Verse 10, then David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. But he was recognized right away, seemingly, at least as far as the text reads, but he was recognized nonetheless. And so then, because he was even famous over there, they even knew the song.
Yeah.
That's how far and wide his notoriety, David's notoriety, had spread. And so they're saying, well, wait a minute, isn't this David? And they even call him the king of the land. I don't know that they necessarily knew that he was anointed king of Israel, but perhaps because he was of such a stature that he was like a lord of the land. And in a sense he was, almost second in command to Saul, really, being commander of his army and things.
He did kill Goliath.
And he did kill Goliath, yes. So, but they knew about him. And so David realizes this pretty quickly and then has to do something. And what does he do?
That's crazy.
Yes, he does. He feigns insanity. And Achish is like, what? We have enough insane people in this territory. I don't need another one. Why did you bring him here? I was trying to think if I got this here somewhere. Oh, that's right. No, I don't even know if I should bring that up. But anyway, okay, any questions or anything about this?
I just have a comment that for some reason it reminds me of Hamlet. And
Hamlet.
it just makes me wonder, I wonder if that's where Shakespeare got the idea.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That crazy like that?
Yeah, all right. Maybe, let's see what I have here on my notes. Oh, the only point I make here is that, of course, David, it works, right? And he gets away, and goes somewhere else, as we'll read in chapter 22. But what I have written here is that this success that David has here in Gath and being able to get out of this situation puts him in the same category as like Abraham and Isaac. Do you remember these, who outwitted other Philistine kings when their lives were threatened? And so it kind of puts him in that category. Let's see what else. This is not my own, but I did swipe this quote from a commentator who said, he said, David's actions also sharpened the contrast between David and Saul. David took upon himself the trappings of insanity to hide his sanity, but Saul surrounded himself with the trappings of sanity to cloak his insanity. Thought that was interesting. I do also want to say, I haven't said it yet, but I do want to say that as you're reading through these chapters, there are many psalms that supposedly David wrote during this time period. So I'm going to give those to you. We're not going to go through them here. I do, and I would like to, after we get through the life of David, one of the classes at the end, I would like to go through David and the Psalms, the ones that he wrote. So I do plan to have a class dedicated to that. But if you wanted to later this week, or I don't know, whatever, right here you could put Psalm 34 and Psalm 56. Now, when you go over to those Psalms, there's going to be, before each Psalm begins, there's sometimes a subtitle. A Psalm of David when he was in the cave. Something like that. Those subtitles, keep in mind, are not inspired. Okay? But most scholars count on them as pretty reliable from when they came, but still at the same time, they're not inspired, so they could be wrong. It could be that David didn't even actually write that when he was in the cave. But anyway, so some of these Psalms some of them are pretty obvious. When you go to Psalm 51 and it's about, and it's titled about when David sinned with Bathsheba. Well, that seems pretty obvious because of the Psalm. But some of these you may be like, well, I don't know, maybe he wrote that at some other time. And it could be. But traditionally, Psalm 56 and Psalm 34 are pegged right here in this chapter at Gath. All right? Okay. So moving on, chapter 22, David escapes from Gath and now goes to a cave in Adullam. If you look on your map, you'll see that Adullam is not very far from Gath. Do you see it? It's just to the east of Gath. It's closer now into Judah's territory, into Israel's land. All right. So this is where David goes next, to the cave of Adullam. And a few things happen here. So this is when David's family comes to him. This is chapter 22, verse 1. David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. But they weren't the only ones. Verse 2 says, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, so he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. So not only does David's family come to him when he's back in Israel's territory over here, probably in order to be safe from Saul, right? Because, if Saul's going to be after David for no good reason, then there's just a matter of turning a switch in his brain that would make him want to go and kill the rest of his family. And so they flee as soon as they learn that David's back in their territory. And so they go to David. But not only them, now we have about 400 men who are hard pressed in their lives, right? They come to him, and so he becomes the leader of these discontented, disenchanted, mistreated members of society who probably were yearning for some kind of change, right? And were willing to share in David's fate and perhaps trusted him a lot because of his reputation. And so they went to him.
So are they part of his family, or is that different people?
That would be different people,
Okay.
not part of his family. Yes, his family came to him, but also these about 400 men who were, as it says here, discontented, etc. And so now he has a small army, right? He becomes captain over them. But David's family doesn't stay with him. David apparently thinks, I've got to make sure they stay safe because I can't travel with my elderly parents and all of my, siblings and cousins or whoever. I can't travel with all these people and protect everybody when I'm leading my own army. And so he goes from the cave of Adullam to Mizpah, which is very far. Very far, yes. It's over in Moab, which is on the
Oh,
other
wow.
side of the Dead
This way.
Sea. I read that it's about 100 miles.
Mm.
That's a long distance. It's out of it's out of Israelite territory. It's with the Moabites. Why, maybe? Why do you suppose David took his family there? Anybody have any good reasons? Any good ideas?
Cause Saul wasn't
Keep them
king
safe, I
there.
guess.
Right, that is, I think, is part of it. Saul had already warred with Moab during his reign, and so they were enemies. And so Saul, because he was not a very good king, would never probably go there to try to war with them again. You know what I mean? He was already counting. He had better things to do here, I guess. In hunting for David. So perhaps yes, I think that plays into it. But I think there's a more important reason. Where was David's great-grandmother Ruth from?
Moab.
Yes, indeed.
Mm.
Jesse's grandmother, Ruth, was a Moabitess. This is her homeland. And so, perhaps, due to their heritage, David takes them there knowing that they'll be safe. They'd be welcome and that they'd be safe. I don't know, the text doesn't say how long they stayed there. They didn't stay there perpetually, I don't think. But it just doesn't tell us how long they dwelt there. Because, here's why I know they probably didn't stay there perpetually, is because later when David does become king, he does go to war with Moab. They are enemies of God's people. But they have been a help a couple of different times for God's people. Like when Naomi and Elimelech went there to seek refuge during the famine. That was a big help to them. And then, of course, Ruth became an Israelite, and then you have David, and so now they're helping Israel again, in essence, here, by harboring David's family. Okay, so that's that. Here in verse 5, we are introduced for the first time to a prophet named Gad. Gad here tells David to not stay in the stronghold, but to go to the land of Judah. So he needs to go back to the land of Judah. And so David departs and he goes to the forest of Hareth. Okay. Gad, I just want to say a couple of things about him. He apparently was a court prophet of David, like Nathan. We seem to know more about Nathan because of how Nathan exposes David's sin with Bathsheba. But Gad was, I think, very much a part of David's life and court as Nathan was. I have a couple of references here. Oh yeah, at the end of 2 Samuel, toward the end of 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel 24, I don't know if y'all recall this, but David sins against God by numbering Israel. I don't know if anybody recalls that, but anyway, it is something that God didn't want him to do, but he does it anyway. And Gad is the one who calls him on it. Okay, and then apparently in 1 Chronicles 29:29, Gad is listed there as a prophet who wrote a book, wrote a history of David's reign. Nathan, I think, is listed there too. But Gad is also, and we don't really hear a whole lot about him, but he seems to be a pretty important fella, a pretty important prophet. So we're first introduced to Gad here. Okay. And now we get to talk about the enemy Doeg, the evil man Doeg. Beginning in verse 6 through the end of this chapter, we won't be able to read all that, but y'all remember what happened up here. Saul is throwing his pity party, and he's threatening his servants because nobody seems to be on his side, and nobody's helping him. And verse 8 he says, all of you have conspired against me. There's no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and none of you are feeling sorry for me. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. Well then, Doeg, the Edomite, speaks up in verse 9. Well, here, I got something for you, king. I saw David at Nob with Ahimelech, and he inquired of the Lord for him. Ahimelech did. And Ahimelech gave him provisions, and Ahimelech gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So then, beginning in verse 11, the king calls for Ahimelech, right? And all his father's house. Everybody comes to the king. And then Saul directs his servants to kill all of the priests. But they refuse, don't they? Thankfully, it obviously went against their conscience because they were felt strong enough about it that they were willing to go against the king's command. And so they said no, but Doeg, he's like, well, I can do it. I'll do it. So that's what Doeg does. Kills the 85 prophets of the Lord. And not only that wasn't even enough, right? Verse 18, the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Brutal. But he does it. Unnecessary violence, right? A foolish royal order carried out by Doeg. But I'm sorry.
Take the E out of that, you use a dog.
A dog, yes, very good. Yeah. But one man escapes, right? This is verse 20. Now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. I've often wondered about that. You have these 85 priests who die on the same day, and you'd think, and maybe, apparently, you would think, maybe Doeg had his own men, his own entourage that were willing to do whatever he wanted them to do. Because you'd think if it was just one man doing the killing, that you'd think after killings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the rest of the 80 would run or disperse or attack or whatever.
They were priests. I don't know if they would have attacked.
Yeah, and that they wouldn't have had any weapons.
Mhm.
But still, one man escapes.
Yeah.
So we have Abiathar escaping, and he runs and apparently knows where David is, or at least finds him, and tells David what Saul has done. He says in verse 21, and Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priest, which, of course, Doeg physically did it, but it was Saul's wish, and so Saul is blamed here for it. David realizes, oh, I knew as soon as I saw Doeg that day when I went to see Ahimelech that something bad might happen from it, and sure enough, and so David feels some guilt here, right? He says at the end of verse 22, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house, but you stay with me, don't fear, because he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be saved. So he harbors Abiathar. Let me see what I have written here. Oh yeah. So there's something that needs to be said here about this situation. Let me see if I have it written in my notes over here. Yeah. Okay. This is going to take some explanation. Okay. Do y'all remember in the first of this book, so if you return all the way back to like chapter 2, what I'm getting at is that this killing of the 85 priests is actually a prophetic fulfillment, a pronouncement by God. Eli, you remember that Eli's sons were very wicked. Eli was the priest. His sons were very wicked. Samuel, though, grew up as a child before Eli. Okay. Look at chapter 2, beginning in verse 22. Eli was very old, and he heard everything that his sons did, how evil they were. He's telling them it's not good that you do all this. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see where I want to pick up. Verse 27. So Eli knows that his sons are evil. They are not acting in a godly way at all as priests. And in verse 27, it says there that a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus says the Lord." So this is what God says. "Did I not clearly reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? Did I not choose him," meaning Aaron, "out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod before me? And did I not give to the house of your father all the offerings of the children of Israel made by fire? Why then do you kick at my sacrifice and my offering which I have commanded in my dwelling place, and honor your sons more than me, to make yourselves fat with the best of all the offerings of Israel my people? Therefore the Lord God of Israel says, I said indeed that your house and the house of your father would walk before me forever. But now the Lord says, far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed." This is it, verse 31. "Behold, the days are coming that I will cut off your arm and the arm of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house." So there is the prophetic utterance against Eli's house, his lineage, his priestly lineage. And guess who is of the lineage of Eli? Ahimelech, the priest, at Nob. And so there we have now in chapter 22 an initial fulfillment of this. Of course, I forgot to mention this over here in chapter 2. God says, this is how you're going to know that I'm going to do this. Your sons are going to die in the same day, which they do. Both of his sons, Hophni and Phinehas?
Yeah.
They both die in the same day, and this on that day too is when the ark is captured by the Philistines. And then when Eli hears of this, he's sitting on this wall, and he's fat, the verse says. And he hears this news and is shocked by it, and he falls backwards and breaks his neck. And so then he dies. But one of his daughters-in-law gives birth on that day and names her son Ichabod. I can't remember what it means. Where is it? Oh yeah, chapter 4, verse 19. Now his daughter-in-law Phinehas, his wife, was with child due to be delivered, and when she heard the news of the ark, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself, gave birth, because her labor pains came upon her. She named him Ichabod, which means, I think that means glory, inglorious. So the opposite of glory. Inglorious, because the glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured, and because her father-in-law and her husband were dead. So the lineage of, the whole point is, the lineage of Eli is continuing, but it won't be, because God says, I'm going to stamp you out, right? And so he does it almost fully here in chapter 22, with the killing of these 85 priests. But Abiathar, who is still of the lineage of Eli, he escapes. So there's one left. But you may want to write this down. Solomon takes care of him in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 27. It says there that Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord. So Abiathar served a long time during David's reign and began to serve during Solomon's. But Solomon took him out. And it says there in 1 Kings 2:27, so Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord, fulfilling the word the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. So there we have it explicitly. This was all a fulfillment of God's prophetic utterance to Eli, way back at the beginning of 1 Samuel. So really, what we can gather from this in 1 Samuel 22 when this happens is we see the sovereignty of God, is what we see here. God is still king in Israel. And he is faithful to what he prophesies. So that even during the dark days of Saul's worst crimes, God is still fulfilling his word to Israel and accomplishing his purposes for David. Here. So that's kind of the big picture. Look at this occasion here in chapter 22. All right? You could also write Psalm 52 here about Doeg the Edomite. You could read that one along with this chapter if you wanted to. Anything before we move to chapter 23? We gotta hurry. Wow, we have to hurry. Okay. So now we have in chapter 23, David, it says in verse 1, then they told David, saying, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are robbing the threshing floors. So this is the Philistines attacking God's people. And so David inquires of the Lord, should I go and attack the Philistines at Keilah? And God says, go do it. But David's men were afraid in verse 3. And they were second guessing this whole adventure. And so David inquires of the Lord again in verse 4. But the Lord confirms, go down to Keilah, because I am going to deliver the Philistines into your hands. And so verse 5, David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, struck them with a mighty blow, and took away their livestock. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Verse 6 is interesting. This is where apparently, you know how this is not we kind of have to we recap sometimes, we revert to, okay. So verse 6 tells us it happened when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech fled to David at Keilah that he went down with an ephod in his hand. So he followed or found, maybe that's where he found David, was at Keilah, which we didn't learn before in chapter 22. Anyway, so then verse 8. Saul gets wind that David is in Keilah and had a great victory. And so Saul called all the people together for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. So now Saul's on his tail at Keilah. Verse 9, David knew that Saul plotted evil against him, and so he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod, I've got to inquire of the Lord. And so he inquires of the Lord again and says, if I stay, is Saul going to come and get me? And God says, yes, he is. So then what does David do? Stay? No. He arises, this is verse 13, so David and his men, about 600 now, not 400, arose and departed from Keilah and went wherever they could go. Saul got wind of that, so he halted the expedition at Keilah. So that was David at Keilah. Don't really have a whole lot more to say about that. A lot could be said in this little section, but we don't have time for that. David then in verse 14 goes to the wilderness of Ziph. Oh, Keilah is on the map. I'm sorry, I didn't put that there.
Where is it? Oh,
Right,
okay.
right in the middle at the top.
Yep. I'm sorry, I didn't even, it just kept going.
Seventh place.
Okay, Keilah, yes, I don't think I have anything else written there. So David was last in the forest of Hereth. You see it right next to it, well, at least the name, the words. So he was in the general vicinity of Keilah. It was pretty close, very close. Probably within a day's journey, close. So it wasn't very far. But now he's wandering. He's going wherever he can go. And so now we find him in verse 14 in the wilderness of Ziph. You see that on your map? Closer to the Dead Sea a little bit. See Ziph. Everybody see that? Okay. So this is now where we pick up. He's in Ziph. This is where Jonathan comes and sees him for the last time. We read this last week in class. Verse 16, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God and said, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father knows that. So they kind of renew this covenant that they had made before the Lord. And David stays in the woods, and Jonathan goes back to his house. Okay? So David is in Ziph, but the Ziphites turn on him and tell Saul that he's there. Dumb Ziphites. So they disclose David's location to Saul. And then, of course, Saul's on the move. But David then leaves because he knows that Saul's coming. And he goes, this is verse 24. David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon. And so now they've moved to this other wilderness. Maon, you see it on the map there. It's a little farther south.
Okay.
A few miles away. And here, of course, Saul is still in hot pursuit and knows that David went there. And it sounds like from the text that this is probably the closest Saul had ever gotten to David. Like, into trapping him is what I mean. I know they have that occasion in the cave, but to trapping David with his army, because it says in verse 26, Saul went on one side of the mountain and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. So David made haste to get away from Saul because Saul and his men were encircling David. and his men to take them. So he was very close here. But then God intervenes, right? Verses 27, 28. A messenger came to Saul and said, "Hurry and come back, because the Philistines have invaded the land." So now Saul halts his expedition here. He returns from pursuing David and went to fight against the Philistines who had invaded his land. That sounds like God's providence to me. And so verse 29 says that David went up from there and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. And so now we have, opening up in chapter 24, David in the wilderness of En-gedi. On the map, you see it's a little close, let's see, farther north, straight east almost of Ziph, near the Dead Sea. Did everybody see that? Somewhere in there.
Forest?
The word's in the Dead Sea.
En-gedi.
And Getty. Oh,
Yeah.
Here it is.
Okay.
Right here.
So
It's in the water.
we have here, very quickly, Saul is told that David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Apparently he's done fighting the Philistines now. So Saul takes 3,000 chosen men to go seek out David, but everybody knows what happens here, right? On the way, or as he's pursuing David, he goes into a cave to go to the restroom. And it happens to be the cave where David and his men are hiding. But Saul doesn't know that, obviously.
Big cave.
Yeah, big
Big.
cave. Of course, you would know as well.
Yeah.
Just there are a lot of
Yeah, a lot of-
huge
yeah.
caves over in this area of the country, of the world. And so it was big enough to hold all of these men of David, and that's where Saul went in to go to the restroom. And so while he's in there, that's when David cuts off the edge of his robe. He was pushed by his men to go ahead and kill him now, because now here the Lord has placed him right here, and here's your chance. That's what they said. The Lord has put him here. Now's your chance to take his life. Of course, David doesn't, but he does cut off the corner of his robe, and then he feels guilty about that. Right? I hope everybody read this chapter. We
Yeah.
just don't have
We
time to
did.
go through all of this.
Yeah.
Okay.
You did.
Uh-huh.
Right. I do, I guess, want to, what do I want to read? No, I don't want to read that. Yeah. David over and over says, I'm not going to stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. So he didn't let anybody else do it either. He didn't let anybody else kill him. And then Saul does his business, goes out of the cave and is on his way a little bit. And then finally David comes out, calls to him, and then you know how it goes from there. And then the whole David or Saul swore to David that he would not pursue him anymore. He admits his sin and his guilt and how he's been, unfair to David. But it's all just a show. Yeah, he doesn't mean it obviously because he keeps doing it. Anyway, so that's what happens in this cave in the wilderness of En-gedi. And then we have chapter 25, verse 1. Samuel dies. I think this is important to the narrative. It has to be made known because of what eventually will happen in chapter 28. But we don't have time to go there. But here we have, what does the ESV say at the end of verse 1? David arose and went down to the wilderness of
Haran.
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 Anybody else have a different word there? Different
Where
name?
is this?
At the end of verse
25.
1, 25,
Verse
1.
Oh,
25.
wilderness near En-gedi.
25.
Oh, 25.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was writing.
25, 1 at the end.
Okay.
P-A-R-A.
Uh-huh.
Perrin, yeah.
Yeah.
Perrin.
Okay. What's interesting about this is that I have a little footnote in my Bible, and you may too, that says LXX, Maon. Okay, so the Septuagint actually puts the word Maon here, the wilderness of Maon, which you see that on your map because he was just there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, from what I understand, the original Hebrew word though is Paran. Now you won't find Paran on this map because it is way down here in the Sinai Peninsula, where Mount Sinai is, where Moses was.
Wow.
So it's way down in here, the wilderness of Paran, which seems like a really long distance to go, right? And so that's why people put this footnote in, because it seems highly unlikely that David would have traveled that far. And not only that, but because where is Nabal from? Look at verse 2.
Moab.
Yeah, there was a man in Maon. So you see how then the Septuagint switched that to Maon, because now they're trying to connect it to what the rest of what happens in chapter 25. But I don't think it's entirely impossible for David to have gone
He
to the
went everywhere
wilderness
else.
of Paran. That's exactly right. But nonetheless, just so you're aware, the Hebrew did say Paran, but the Septuagint, the Greek translation, says Maon. So you can make of that what you will. I even think I have some notes on that about it. Let me see what I wrote here. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so chapter 25. Like we do, or at least like I've done, with chapter 17 and the whole occasion of David and Goliath, I know that with chapter 25 we seem to take that out of the book and make it its own thing, right? The whole seemingly romantic story of a hero, a heroine, and a hero, and they're getting together, and that kind of, she's beautiful and all those things, and David's good looking. It's a whole thing, right? Okay, and so we tend to take chapter 25 out, like we take chapter 17 out with David and Goliath. And in that, I've done that. I've made lessons on these chapters. It's a whole, that's okay too, because there is a lot to be gleaned when you just take the chapters out. But as we're trying to do in this class, we're trying to keep it within its historical context and the flow of the narrative. And so, that said, this chapter, I think, is so pivotal to this book, to the story of David. And why I say that is because this text is really about David's transition from a young man being exiled and on the run to the ideal king. God's moving towards a new kingdom, right, with David. And it shows here how God is, of course, all of this shows how God is preserving and protecting, and now perhaps teaching David how to grow into this new role that he's going to have. And so this chapter is really, with Nabal, it's a test case for David, I think. Because this chapter is bookended with chapter 24, where David spares Saul the first time, and chapter 26, where David spares Saul the second time. But I wonder if it wasn't for this occasion with Nabal and Abigail, if David would have spared Saul the second time. Because you know how angry David got and was seeking to avenge himself against Nabal, because Nabal treated him and his men so badly. So, and we know how much of a warrior, a fighter, David was. And perhaps in chapter 24, the temptation was very real for David to strike Saul right there in the cave. And I can't help but imagine David fighting the flesh on that occasion, seeing how easy it could have been to do it. Half his army was outside anyway, and he would have come out victorious over this king, and they would have been, yay, we're following David, and a great start to the kingdom, right? To David's reign. So maybe all of those thoughts were going through David's mind, and the temptation was very real for him. After all, he was already, he felt guilty about even cutting off the robe, right? And so he was able to think clearly there in the cave. He had clarity about it. But now when we're in chapter 25, he's very rash, very hasty, he's quick. He's ready to go after and not leave a man alive in Nabal's family.
Well, he wasn't anointed, that's for sure.
Well,
Nabal was
no,
not
that's for
anointed.
sure. But there's still that warrior,
Well,
fighter,
he's angry.
yes, and anger, yes. And so I think we have Nabal as a test case. Will David continue to allow the Lord to work vengeance, or is David going to take matters into his own hands, kind of thing? I already said that. I think that's the grand idea here. I think, and that's why I think this is such a pivotal chapter. When you keep it within the context of the narrative here of 1 Samuel. I also think that there's some subtlety in this narrative in that Nabal and Saul are kind of compared here, or have similarities. Let me say that much. I have a few things listed here about the similarities between Nabal and Saul. Number one, both benefited from David's actions. David killed the giant. David was commander of the army. He was very successful. David protected Nabal's sheep and his men all the time that they were with David. Okay, so Nabal and Saul both benefited from David's actions. Both Nabal and Saul's lives were spared by David. Eventually, okay? Yet both react the same way to David, right? With hostility. They both don't like David. I don't want to bring that one up. There might be a little connection between the feasts. So Nabal's throwing a feast, right, because of sheep shearing season. Sorry,
What'd you say after his lives were spared?
I don't know.
Their lives
Oh.
were spared. The third one? Or
Both Nabal and Saul acted with hostility toward David. They both didn't like him. I have the feast. Nabal has a feast here because it's sheep shearing season, and that could bring to mind Saul's feast during the new moon when David didn't show up, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just brings it to our attention that we are dealing with two very wealthy men, socially influential men, who are crazy, basically, right? Okay, but at the same time, you have these two men who hate David, but their families, Nabal's family, Saul's family, Nabal's servants and Saul's servants, were on the side of David in both cases. And both of them had female family members who aided David, right? Abigail, Nabal's wife, helps David. Michal helped David. Okay. Both do eventually die under God's judgment. Right? This is God doing it. God's taking care of both of these men. Okay? And then as a result, David receives the spoil of both of these adversaries. Okay. So there are some similarities there. I do have just a couple of things. Yeah, this is the main idea. Saul, the first anointed king, failed because he refused to accept Yahweh's authority. But David is the ideal anointed king because he does accept Yahweh's authority, and he continues to do so, and is willing to put that authority into practice. He knows that Yahweh is still king over Israel. Saul never got that. And God is, of course, using David as the anointed one to carry out and to govern his people. As far as an application from this chapter, there's 1,000 of them. Now, there's a bunch that could be taken from here. But considering the overall context of, like I said, the book, I do think this one stands out. This is the one I'm going to close with. Kind of like we already mentioned, David, like his ancestor Abraham, who was able to get out from deceive the king of the Philistines to save his life. David did the same thing at Gath, right? Okay. So in the same way, David here, like his ancestors before him, but like Abraham, Jacob, Moses, had the capacity for change, for correction, for modification. A good leader has within him the capacity for change when, especially, or even if, it comes from an unexpected source. And in this case, it was from Abigail. She played a mighty role in changing the future king of Israel's heart. David could hear a word completely unexpectedly from Yahweh and allow it to correct him. His heart was pliable, willing to yield to the hands of the master sculptor. So, that is, I think, the main thing we learn about David in this situation with Abigail and Nabal. But like I said, a whole bunch of other things could be learned here, but that's not the nature of our class, at least this go around. But I do think that's what we learn mainly about David. All right. Any comments, questions, concerns, complaints, criticism? Save those for Clint.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have homework. This was David in the Wilderness Part 1. We are going to do next week, the Lord willing, David in the Wilderness Part 2. This will be chapters 26 through 31 through the end of the book. I would also encourage you to read 1 Chronicles 10, because as you know, a lot of 1 Chronicles replicates or reiterates the history of 2 Samuel, primarily 2 Samuel. But 1 Chronicles 10 reiterates the history of 1 Samuel 31. Okay, and why I think it's important to read it is because sometimes some things are added or missing that could be of significance. And so 1 Samuel 26 through 31, the end of the book, and 1 Chronicles 10, because 1 Chronicles 10 retells chapter 31. Okay? Good. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For being here today. Let's see. I have that written here. Nona.
Yeah.
I think you're up today, aren't you?
Thank you, God, for everything that you give for us. Thank you for the breath that we have, the life that we have, the food, everything around us, good friends, knowledge. Thank you so much for Veronica and her knowledge that she imparts to us through her study, her love of the Word, and her passing that love to us. Be with all of us as we go through the rest of the week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Nona.